Hey guys, Alan Bishop, the Alchemist of Indiana's Black Forest, back once again with the One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute, your source for all things distillation related knowledge-wise, whether it be home distilling and or professional distilling. I like to help where I can, and I'm not always right, and I'm also not the greatest distiller of all time. I just like to share the few things that I do know. So one of the most common questions that I get via the channel, and always feel free to send your questions to bishopshomegrown@gmail.com, and or in the YouTube comments below, or via any of my social media. One of the most common questions that we get is about stuck fermentations, whether it be sugar shine, all grain, etc. And it seems like most of the questions end up being like, hey, I started off at a 1.075 or 1.090 and it stalled out at 1.020. So I wanted to touch on this a little bit. So I typically don't use any nutrient for any of my all grains. I typically don't use any nutrient for any of my sugar shines. I've found that I don't really usually need them. There's more than enough nitrogen in the grain that you're using in order to get through the fermentation for the yeast. If I do add any nutrient, it's really not nutrient. It might be some dead yeast cells from either an Uncle Jesse's simple sour mash where you're reusing the same grain bed, the same yeast bed. Those dead yeast cells are in there. They make budding sites for new yeast propagation. Or you can buy dead yeast cells and or make your own from some cheap bread yeast that you just microwave, etc. I don't even find that that's necessary most of the time. The only time I've ever really had any problems with stuck washes it tends to be wine fermented, and that usually is a fan problem, a free available nitrogen problem. So sometimes I will use some nutrient on those. And I don't use any nutrients that have a ton of minerals in them because they will distill over. Ask me how I know. I've seen this happen at work a few times, unfortunately, working with some winemakers, and it's not fun or pretty. But nonetheless, I wanted to touch base with you, and this is primarily going to be geared towards all grain and or sugar shine that is grain oriented. So I just mentioned there's usually plenty of nitrogen in those grains to feed the yeast. If you're doing a sugar shine, I would still almost always on your initial run, boil the water that you're going to put on the grain. That way it steeps it a little bit, you release some of that nitrogen into the matrix, and the yeast does have something to feed off of during fermentation. Most of the time when a wash stalls out at like 1.020, 1.010, it's one of only a few things that's causing it. The first thing is that you may not have enough diastatic power to have converted all of the starch into sugar if you're doing an all grain. Meaning, in other words, you probably had enough alpha but not enough glucose in order to get through that fermentation. One of the things that causes that, for example, is 2-row malts have plenty, or 6-row malts have plenty of, let me rephrase that, I fucked up again. 2-row malts have plenty of alpha, but not nearly enough glucoamylase in order to get you entirely through a conversion from starch into sugar and then breaking that sugar down further for the yeast to be able to eat. One thing that's happened in recent years is a lot of the big malt houses has switched their distiller's malt over from 6-row to 2-row. And even though their diastatic power is very high, they typically will not finish a conversion process. And so we ran into this at work when I switched over to not using any exogenous enzymes whatsoever on some mash bills, and they were finishing out at 1.010. I racked my mind over this for weeks trying to figure it out. And at one point in time, got desperate enough that I chalked it up to just being a bad distiller until I figured out that the company I was buying my distiller's malt from had switched over to 2-row malt and hadn't bothered to inform anyone. Yes, that sort of thing does happen. The other thing that might happen is if you're using regular two-row brewer's malt, you're never going to get a full efficiency. And this is one of the big differences between pre-prohibition and post-prohibition whiskey. Is pre-prohibition, very, very few distillers were ever 100% efficient in their fermentations, which means that there was some sugar left behind in the fermentation, which is actually a kind of a positive to some degree as long as you're not being wasteful, because even though that sugar doesn't distill across, some of those starchy aromatics that are left behind, right, because it hasn't all been fully converted from starch into sugar, some of those aromatics come across during the distillation process and end up in your finished product. So qualitatively, it's a good thing, unless you're distilling on a very large scale. If you're distilling on a small craft distilling scale, you lose 3 or 4 gallons out of a 150 something gallon run, a finished product, it's no huge deal. If you are someone like Pat Heist at Wilderness Trail, that 4 or 5 gallons suddenly becomes 4 or 5 barrels. Economically, that's a little bigger thing, right? The other reason that a lot of people run into fermentation issues is they're either not using a yeast that will go to as high of an ABV as they're trying to get to. So for example, if you're using Fleischmann's bread yeast, and there's nothing wrong with that, I use it a lot, and you're trying to get 12, 13, 14% alcohol in your fermentation, you're probably going to stall that yeast out, because that yeast is not going to want to go to that high of an alcohol because it is not acclimated to go to that high of an alcohol, right? The other thing is that sometimes if you're using the yeast, especially if it's a yeast that you're propagating yourself, it takes that yeast a little while to acclimate to different environments. So for example, if you're propagating your own yeast and you go from a whiskey wash or a whiskey mash over to a wine, it needs a couple generations on that growing medium to kind of get used to that growing medium before you just throw it in there and shock it and it goes, oh shit, the pH and everything is different here. We don't know how to respond to this, right? You can acclimate them to that, but it does take some time. The question in particular, I believe, came from the most recent one I saw was somebody that had a sugar wash at 1.090. They were using daddy yeast, and I think it finished out at 1.020. I suspect that more than likely that is a nutrient issue, but I think in your message you said that you had adjusted that with nutrients. So it's a very good question. I would check your pH. pH is a big thing. You crash your pH, the yeast is going to stop, right? Sometimes you're crashing that pH because you have a bacterial contamination that slows everything down and stops it. So there's a lot of variables there that can happen, and my goal here was just to touch on the main ones. But definitely keep track of your pH. Understand that everything in the world is going to affect that yeast, whether it's pH or nutrients or alcohol tolerance, how well acclimated that particular yeast is to the environment that you're putting it in, etc. For me, with sugar washes, I've always basically used Fleischmann's yeast or something that I've propagated myself. My buddy Mike Stallings, he always used Red Star. I've used that a few times recently in tributes to him, and always done fine. I also don't aim for a very high specific gravity, and this is something that I'm going to talk about in a future video too. So most commercial distillers, if you're doing whiskey or you're doing brandy or even sugar shine, 1075 is kind of on the high end. Distillers, the more you get into this and the more that you realize, flavor profile, what's going on, you start to realize that those very high specific gravities, unless you're dealing with something like rum where you're dealing with molasses and a lot of unfermentable sugar, or honey, again, unfermentable sugar, those high ABVs don't do you any favors. Yes, they give you more yield, but they certainly don't give you more quality, especially when it comes to sugar. And it could just be that the osmotic pressure of that 1090, I wouldn't think so, but that 1090 might have slowed that daddy yeast down just a little bit potentially. So I'd be curious to see what happened if you were to throw a little nutrient in, throw some new daddy in, and maybe check your pH and see if you need to adjust it up a little bit, because I bet it went a little acidic on you, and it might take back off if you catch it in time. And sometimes you just get what you get, and you need to run it whenever it's done, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about that qualitative thing when it comes to the ABV in a video I'm getting ready to do here in just a little while. As always, check out thealchemistcabinet.com. Go there to find all the links to all of our other projects, including our other podcast, our paranormal podcast, If You Have Ghosts, You Have Everything, the other distilling podcast, Distillers Talk with Christy Atkinson. You can find our books there, our DVDs there, distilling ingredients, etc. And as always, love y'all. Later.